Good evening, and welcome to this brand new season of The Proof is Out There. If you live in a Scandinavian country like Norway, you often get a front row seat to the famous Northern Lights. But while that dazzling sight has a scientific explanation, we found some other lights in the Norwegian skies, and they're leaving us with many more questions than answers. For more than 30 years, computer science professor Erling Strand has been traveling the Hesdalen Valley in his native Norway, spending countless hours investigating a mystery that no one can explain. It's a phenomenon so rare that not many have ever captured it on film. But when it happens, Erling's camera and tripod have been there to record these eerie images. One of Erling's videos, taken on December 4th, 1999, shows a pulsating, flickering light that appears above the horizon. Another video shows what appears to be a single mysterious pulsating light. When we zoom in, the shape, size, and intensity seem to be fluctuating as these lights travel high above the mountains.
There was no natural thing which could make these lights. I found that very little scientific information existed.
Close-up photographs reveal what appears to be an amorphous, gas-like substance. But what are they? The lights have been observed since the 1930s, but investigative journalist M.J. Benaya says it was the period between December 1981 to
Hesdalen very interesting is we don't know if this is some sort of naturally occurring phenomena. We don't know if this is a man-made phenomena. And we also don't know if this could have some sort of otherworldly answer.
While sightings of the lights are not as frequent as they once were, this has not stopped ufologists from believing that the lights are signs of extraterrestrial activity.
Some people believe that due to mineral deposits or the location of a specific mountain or valley, that UFOs are drawn to it, or that valleys and mountains play host to sort of underground bases for UFO pilots.
But researchers have recently come up with a more earthly explanation. The unusual lights may be caused by a natural battery buried deep underground, created by metallic minerals reacting with sulfur in the river running between them.
The area itself is very rich in minerals. For a very long time, mining operations have existed in the area, predominantly for minerals like copper and zinc, and these lights could be somehow connected to the mining operations that occur in the valley.
Researchers are so determined to figure out this phenomenon that in 1998, a permanent station called the Blue Box began monitoring the valley with a magnetometer, 2 black and white cameras, and 1 color camera. Clearly something strange is going on there. But what? We asked our experts to weigh in. Physics professor Matthew Shadaga says that since teams of scientists have been studying this phenomenon for decades, they've had plenty of time to eliminate several of the more mundane explanations.
We've already ruled out car, airplane, helicopter, because those objects don't fit the description of these lights, which have different behaviors, blinking on and off, changing shape, changing color.
While Shadaga says that the natural battery theory makes sense, it's still just a theory.
The natural minerals in the area may develop positive and negative charges naturally, like in your everyday battery. So if you have a strong enough electric field, you might end up with what look like lights in the sky. The downside of the natural battery theory is these minerals are not necessarily next to each other. They're separated by the river in the area.
Astronomer and video effects designer Mark D'Antonio says another leading theory is that the lights are literally generated by the Earth.
The theory is that the lights are generated by some type of electrical energy coupled with some magnetic influences that ends up becoming visible in the air as naturally caused lights. In the same way that you scruff your feet on a carpet and touch something metal and you see a little spark between your finger and that metal thing, that might be able to occur on a larger scale. But I think that we're lacking information to say definitively what they are. So we don't know for sure exactly what we're seeing here. But it is a rather compelling video nonetheless.
Our verdict? We're calling this an unexplained phenomenon. While the theory that the geology of Norway is causing the Hesdalen lights is compelling, it is still only a theory. And it begets the question, why don't we see this battery effect around other similar geological areas? One thing is certain, more research is needed. And if you want to head to Norway to do it, they'll leave the lights on for you. We turn now from the skies to the seas, and another puzzling piece of footage. We normally think of great white sharks as the apex predator of the ocean, and that's often the case. But in this next video, as you'll see, a massive great white shark looks like it's been attacked by something even greater. But what? December 2021, photographer Jalil Najafov is on a dive in Isla Guadalupe, Mexico. Conditions are ideal, sun in the sky, and visibility excellent. Suddenly, he spots and photographs a huge shark. The estimate is 15 feet long. That's as long as a canoe. But look at this. As you see here, the shark looks like it's been attacked by something else with massive jaws. Let's take a closer look. Field researcher Ken Gerhardt tells us that there are a few potential suspects here.
So this is a fossilized tooth from a shark known as Otodus megalodon that supposedly went extinct over 2 million years ago during the Pliocene epoch. This was a large predatory shark that scientists estimate could have gotten as big as 40 to 60 feet long. In terms of whether megalodon might still be alive, there are some interesting accounts. For example, in 1918, several fishermen off the coast of Australia described seeing a monstrous ghostly white shark 100 feet in length. So is it possible that something like megalodon could still survive into modern times? And certainly if it did, it would be capable of inflicting a wound this large on this very large shark. Pretty terrifying.
There are also some intriguing stories of giant sharks in fishermen's tales. In 1959, Robert Pamprin was killed by a great white shark near San Diego. Another diver claimed he saw Pamprin waist deep in a 20-footer's mouth before the shark, in one gulp, swallowed the rest of him whole. Supposedly, this shark was as big as a killer whale, and fishermen days later reported seeing a shark 20 to 40 feet long in the same area. That's even bigger than Jaws. There are, however, other possible culprits for a bite like this. Perhaps one of the world's most notorious sharks?
The largest great white shark ever photographed, which was given the name Deep Blue, was a female that was about 20 feet long. And that particular shark was photographed in a similar region off the coast of Mexico. So it certainly opens the door to the possibility that this bite wound was inflicted by Deep Blue.
This isn't the first time we've seen a shark's wound that has frightened seamen. We investigated this fisherman's catch, a mako shark weighing at least 250 pounds, that looked like it was bitten in half by something much bigger. So we know sharks can go from predator to prey, but exactly whose jaws are responsible for this attack? First, we turn to marine biologist Shay Conger to tell us just how hard it would be for something to inflict a bite this size on a shark like this.
Shark skin is incredibly tough. It's actually a series of plates. So to have bitten through an animal like this would take a large amount of force. This injury is actually very well healed, so we can only imagine what it looked like when it was fresh.
Okay, so it's got to be big. But how likely is it that something this big could be lurking in the deep without us knowing?
There's some theories that this injury could have been caused by the extinct megalodon. We haven't found any evidence of it, and in fact, when we study large sharks like this, in the fossil record, often the only thing that we have to know about them are their teeth that survive. The last known fossil record of a megalodon was over 20 million years ago.
Conger says if megalodon were still around, we'd have some newer teeth.
The idea that a species this large and this predatory would survive for so long without us noticing is really unlikely. Also, a megalodon's bite was extremely enormous, meaning if this were a megalodon bite, the shark would either be bitten in half or completely consumed.
In fact, megalodons may have been even larger than experts suspected. According to a new 3D model created by scientists,
These sharks may have been up to 65 feet long and weighed over 67 tons. At this size, its jaws could consume a 26-foot orca in a few bites. Those figures don't match up with the wound we see here. So if it's not a megalodon, could it be something a little more familiar?
Some possible candidates for the bite marks on the shark could include a killer whale.
It's not so hard to believe. In South Africa, scientists have observed a pair of orcas serial killing big great white sharks over a period of 5 years. However, Conger says the bite simply doesn't match.
I think this is unlikely because killer whales have really round, tubular-shaped teeth, and we would see a lot of really defined teeth mark here.
Next, we turn to biologist Floyd Hayes, a shark enthusiast who thinks he might know what happened here.
This is a female great white shark. We know it's a female because the males have long extensions of the pelvic fins called claspers, which are kind of like penises. Because no flesh appears to have been removed, it doesn't look like it's a predatory bite. It's very possible that Deep Blue could have done this, or perhaps from a male during mating.
The shallow nature of this scarring rules out a predatory attack. Sharks that attack their own aggressively, sometimes known as cannibal sharks, leave deeper wounds, often ripping their prey apart completely.
Our verdict, this was an injury sustained at the jaws of another shark. While Deep Blue would be large enough to make such an impression, she's also a female, so it's unlikely that she could have been responsible if the injury were sustained during mating. So that begets the question, is there a male out there that rivals Deep Blue in size, swimming undetected? The force of a punch is a function of muscle mass, but also of leverage and precision. But one girl seemingly has a punch so powerful, some wonder if she could be a real-life member of the X-Men.
It's March 2018 in Voronezh, Russia. 12-year-old Evnika Sadvatkas is stretching and apparently prepping for a workout by shadowboxing in the woods. But as the camera keeps rolling, Evnika shocks everyone by really kicking it, or punching it, into high gear. She begins throwing a series of vicious jabs and hooks on the trunk of a nearby tree. And as her gloved fists strike the wood, it begins to splinter away. Mental Floss editor Erin McCarthy is amazed.
Is she literally a video game character? I mean, she is just destroying that tree.
After less than a minute, the young boxer successfully shatters the tree with only the power of her two fists. The video of Evnika's astounding feat soon goes viral, and viewers take to calling her the world's strongest girl.
She's actually been training since she was 4 years old with her father, who was himself a boxer. She is punching at the tree because apparently that improves her speed and accuracy, and she decided that she wanted to take the tree out.
And it's not the first time Evnika's skills have been filmed. A year earlier, she's seen punching down a tree without any gloves. And in this video, she hits a metal door until she dents it and then knocks it in. Some question if she was born with a genetic mutation that makes her super strong. One possibility is myostatin-related muscle hypertrophy.
Myostatin is a protein that the body produces, and essentially it represses the growth of muscles. So people who have this genetic disorder don't have as much of that protein, which means their muscles can grow. And we saw this in a mere toddler. He actually had 40% more muscle mass than kids his age.
Whoa. So is it possible that we have a team of super kids running around whose strengths far exceed experts weigh in?
First, theoretical physicist Dr. Michio Kaku analyzes if this feat can be attributed to a genetic condition or abnormality like myostatin-related muscle hypertrophy.
There is a gene that actually makes you bulk up and makes you look like a Superman. But the strength of the muscle is proportional to the cross-sectional area, the thickness of the muscle. That's what gives it its strength. And the cross-sectional area of her muscles is normal for a girl that age. She does not have that muscle mass, but she has technique. But that's not enough.
Since she's not that bulky, it's also not performance-enhancing drugs. But Kaku describes another anatomical theory.
Every time you hit something, your bones get jostled a bit. Sometimes there are microfractures that you can't even see. But when it heals over, nature overcompensates.
Conventional wisdom says that broken bones heal back stronger. So maybe Evnika fractured her hand bones before, giving her fists of stone today. Well, not so fast. Any extra firmness only lasts temporarily at the point of fracture, while the bone is healing. So if there's no evidence of natural or juiced-up superhuman strength, is this simply a demonstration of superhuman skills? We return to Dr. Matthew Shadagas, who says biomechanics and the angle of attack can make a difference.
Breaking something is about pressure, and pressure is force per unit area. You can create a huge amount of pressure with a small amount of force if that force is applied over a small enough area. So what I think we're seeing here is this young girl is strategically applying her fists in the right places to deliver the maximum amount of pressure in the same way that martial arts masters break through blocks of wood.
Knowing how to use her arms like levers and her joints like the fulcrums of a machine helps her maximize the force even more. Still, Kaku thinks there's more going on here than just being a talented boxer with the right technique. It's important where the trees fall on the Jenka hardness scale, which measures how resistant wood is to denting and basic wear.
If that tree were a hardwood tree, it wouldn't splinter like that, but it's splintering left and right, not just at the impact point. That means it's probably an older tree, perhaps eaten by insects, and so that contributes to the weakness of the tree.
As a tree decomposes, the wood cellulose and lignin turn into carbon dioxide and water. This can be caused by wounds, which lead to infection or fungi that feed on the lignin. Yet Shadaga says the tree's relative hardness takes nothing away from the girl's innate abilities and skills.
It's probably a dead, dry tree, which makes it easier to break. But even if she doesn't know the mathematics herself, she's instinctively applying her fists at different angles, allowing her to completely take out that tree.
Our verdict, the footage proves that though she may not have the muscle mass, Evnika is a very strong and highly trained boxer who has the technique to apply maximum force using her arms biomechanically as levers. Her skill against a tree in a seeming state of decomposition with a lower Jenka hardness rating makes it a TKO for this boxing prodigy. The dinosaurs in the Jurassic Park franchise have thrilled audiences for decades. But of course, they're complete works of fiction. Or are they? According to the findings of a crew in Africa, life may have found a way.
It's 1992. A Japanese expedition travels to Lake Tale in the heart of the Congo forest. There they capture video that's been sparking debate for the past 30 years. Soaring high over the African jungle, they roll on what lies below. And as the crew reaches Lake Tale, their camera shifts focus to the water when they find this. What appears to be some type of large creature swimming just below the water surface. The crew claimed they'd captured a prehistoric creature. Take a closer look. When we freeze and push in, many have said this looks like the head and back of a dinosaur. Field researcher and author Ken Gerhardt says this is alleged to be a famed beast known as the Mokele Mbembe.
Mokele Mbembe is an iconic cryptid, so this footage is rather significant.
Wait, a dinosaur alive in Africa? The locals say yes.
The natives describe the Mokele Mbembe as having a long, flexible neck with a snake-like head attached, a huge brown or gray body with 4 stout legs and a long, powerful tail. Although it's described as being an herbivore or a vegetarian, it's hyper-aggressive and territorial, and it's said to overturn canoes, drowning people, as well as killing hippos.
The description kind of matches what we're seeing here. Plus, remember, the Congo Basin is 500 million acres of rainforest. New species get discovered there all the time. And we know the legend stretches back hundreds of years.
The reports go back to the 16th century, but perhaps the most remarkable story dates back to 1959. The local pygmies set up a series of spikes sticking out of the ground. And allegedly, one of these Mokele-mbembe animals actually impaled itself on these stakes. And the pygmies finished the job by hacking the animal to bits with their machetes. And afterwards, there was a celebration in which they ate the meat of the Mokele-mbembe.
Mokele-mbembe means the one who stops the flow of rivers. And this thing certainly looks big enough to earn that name. Let's go to the telestrator here. Look at the leading edge here. Doesn't this look like it could be a neck? A couple of humps here. Here's the bigger of the two humps. That's the first one. Here's the second one. And this certainly looks like the wake behind the creature as it heads in this direction. A brontosaurus? I mean, could this African creature really be a holdout from the Cretaceous period? We turn to our experts now for a closer look.
Wildlife biologist Stephanie Schuttler weighs the options. If this isn't the long-lost Mokele-mbembe, could it be a watercraft mistaken for the famous beast?
I don't think this is a boat, mostly because this dark curved shape in the front. People in this area with boats, it's just basic dugout canoes, so you wouldn't see anything extending like that.
Schuttler also examines the hydrology, the movement of the water.
The water trail is so dark that suggests there's mud or something. If it were just wake from a canoe, I don't think you'd be able to see it from the air.
So whatever is making this wake is moving along the muddy bottom, and that's how marine biologist Shay Conger eliminates the possibility of it being a downed tree.
This definitely isn't something like a log because it has a wake behind it. And you can see in the footage that it's moving. So this is definitely a biological animal.
So could it be the legendary lost dinosaur?
Mokele-mbembe is thought to be a lost sauropod. However, this doesn't fit the body structure of a sauropod. This would have to be the long neck, and you don't really see a head on top. Sauropods, although their heads were small, it didn't disappear completely. Also, just the body shape here is wrong. They didn't have this double hump feature, so it just doesn't fit with what shows up in the fossil record.
Still, new dinosaur fossils are discovered all the time. In fact, on average, over 45 fossils have been found per year since 2003. But Conger sees another possibility for what's waiting in the water.
What people think is a neck looks a whole lot like an elephant's trunk. So this is probably a forest elephant, which live in the jungles of the Congo. The idea that a forest elephant would spend a lot of time in water isn't that bizarre. Elephants are able to hold their trunk above their head while they're swimming as a snorkel, and I think that's what we're seeing here.
Our verdict? The trunk was key. We'll say elephant, though some will argue it's perhaps a dinosaur that hasn't been seen yet in the fossil record. The preponderance of sightings by local populations is really fascinating. And now that 500 million Africans have smartphones, if this thing exists, we should hope to see some new footage soon. NASA's Planetary Defense Coordination Office keeps a close eye on asteroids due to the threat of one crashing into Earth and ending life as we know it. But while scientists around the globe were checking out one of these huge flying rocks, they may have made another startling discovery.
It's May 2000 in outer space. NASA's Near-Earth Asteroid Rendezvous spacecraft, known as Near Shoemaker, is on patrol when it trains its gaze on the massive asteroid known as Eros, approximately 221 million miles from Earth. In the process of its surveillance, it captures some startling images. If you look closely at the satellite photo, there appears to be a strange object that's lit up at the center of a crater. Compared to its surroundings, the object has a distinct square and angular appearance, which seems to indicate it's not a natural feature of Eros' surface. NASA catalogs it as a large rectangular boulder. But George Haas of the Cydonia Institute, which advocates theories of ancient Martian civilizations, doubts it's a shape that would ever occur like this naturally.
Now, if anybody's ever seen pictures of these asteroids, they're very highly textured, organic shapes, but then there's this cubic, metallic, flat, smooth feature on here, which is totally out of place. This is a structure that's sitting on this asteroid, and it shouldn't be there.
Haas says this photo has gotten an incredible amount of attention and raises questions about whether this could be evidence of an extraterrestrial colony.
Some believe that this structure on this asteroid is the remnants of an ancient mining operation, and a lot of these asteroids are full of copper. Copper is very scarce now, so if we were to find an asteroid full of that, it would be well worth the trip to set up a mining operation.
Before you write that off as absurd, bear in mind that today, right here on Earth, there are companies that's developing robotic and satellite platforms to enable the exploration and extraction of off-world resources, including from asteroids. Yet Haas suggests that aliens could also be up to something far more sinister.
The Eros asteroid is located in and around the asteroid belt, which is a perfect location if someone was to place a spy station. It's just far enough from Earth not to be detected, and it's close enough to come in and leave their satellites in this area for monitoring what's going on Earth.
Eros was the first near-Earth asteroid discovered. It's about 10 miles across, 5 times bigger than the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. Based on the size of Eros, NASA estimates the mysterious rectangular structure to be about 148 feet across. That's a pretty big mystery. Let's see if our experts can help solve it.
First, astrophotographer Andrew McCarthy takes a look to see if this could be an issue with the way the camera captured this part of the asteroid.
I used a suite of tools in my photography workshop to analyze the photo for any kind of optical anomalies that may have shown up due to pixels inside that sensor that were not behaving properly. My conclusion is that what we're seeing in these photos is entirely authentic.
So since McCarthy says the image is accurate, could this really be an alien structure? Astronomer and visual effects analyst Mark D'Antonio is not convinced.
There's bright spots on this asteroid for a number of reasons. They could be water ice spots or just brighter soil. And when you take a photograph that looks normal for your eyes, for the camera, you overexpose really, really bright things like this.
NASA geologist Dr. Bob Anderson explains.
When you first look at it, you go, wow, that does look kind of strange. It's out of place. But if you blow this image up, you would see that there's multiple craters around here. Asteroids are very violent. These asteroid bodies are floating in that area, and they hit. And so you get these boulders thrown out of them. And because of the lighting angle here, it looks like as if it's a structure, when in fact it's just sitting on the surface there.
So Anderson says the boulder is actually more rounded than it appears. The way the sun is hitting it is playing tricks with the shadows and creating this optical illusion that the rock is a rectangle.
Our verdict? This is most likely a naturally occurring boulder that just appears to be more rectangular than it actually is, due to the angle and the source of light. It only looks lit up because it's brighter than the rest of the rock. Still, NASA hasn't responded to inquiries about this image, so there's a chance there's still more to it than meets the eye. Getting something as small as an eyelash stuck in your eye can be agonizing, but this clip we're about to show you takes it to the next level. The video has people suggesting it documented some sort of miracle. But caution, this one's not so easy on the eyes.
It's October 1996 in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. A young Muslim girl claims she's experiencing an unusual ailment, and the news media comes to investigate. A video filmed by a TV crew shows the girl sitting sullen in a chair, surrounded by her family. Then suddenly her father reaches over and pulls up the lid of her eye. The 12-year-old looks down and slowly sheds what appears to be a crystal tear. As the camera crew keeps rolling, she miraculously produces at least 3 more of these sharp tears, with her eyes seeming to remain unscathed. Journalist Erin McCarthy is amazed at the preteen's composure.
I would expect for her to be incredibly uncomfortable, crying, trying to get whatever it is out, and she just seems totally calm. There's a little irritation, but certainly not what I would expect from something like this in the eye.
What's even more remarkable? Apparently, this isn't the first time this has happened. The girl allegedly produced solid glass crystals 7 times a day for 8 months without any evident injury.
There were doctors who had various theories about it, but her father believed that it was a miracle from God, and the girl actually said that Imam Ali came to her in a vision and told her to give glass shards to people who were sick. Imam Ali is the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad and the first spiritual leader of the Shiites.
When the news breaks, the girl becomes a sensation, and people visit her daily to take home what they believe to be sacred glass.
Shortly after this started happening, she went to stay with an ophthalmologist who tested the shards. She also saw some doctors from Saudi Arabia who tested them. In both instances, they declared that the shards were real without saying what material they actually were. So there's a lot of mystery surrounding this even now.
According to one study, getting something caught in your eye is the second most common form of ocular trauma. Foreign objects can cause abrasions and even some serious damage to the cornea. So what's really going on with these tears? If they're actually made of crystal, how is the girl's eyeball remaining unscathed? Let's see if our experts can clear this up.
Catholic miracle expert and trained engineer Michael O'Neill says if it's some kind of miracle, it's a new kind.
We've heard of stories of icons of the Virgin Mary weeping tears of blood, weeping human tears, in fact, or tears of myrrh. Or there have been cases of stigmatics or other mystics weeping tears of blood, like Teresa Neumann from Germany in the first half of the 20th century. And we've never seen anything like this, though.
Of course, O'Neill specializes in Catholicism, not Islam. But there is no mention of glass tears in the Quran or the Bible. O'Neill doubts that what we're seeing here is miraculous.
We see cases of stigmata, people bleeding from their hands and their side and their feet, and that connects to Jesus and his crucifixion on the cross. Although this is a remarkable phenomenon, I would not consider this to be a miracle. I don't see where faith might come into play.
So did the girl get some broken glass in her eye she's now shedding? Biologist Dr. Floyd Hayes dives into that theory.
If this resulted from some sort of an accident, we would likely see some tears and some bleeding or some scarring. It would most likely be impaled into the tissues and not just simply resting there harmlessly inside of the eye. Her eye looks like it's slightly pinkish down in here, so it may be irritated to some degree, but it doesn't look like it's causing any major damage.
So if it's not broken glass, is the girl's body somehow capable of producing solid crystalline tears?
Tears are basically a clear liquid that are formed by the lacrimal glands, and they have several different nutrients and substances in them. They're basically like salt water. Glass is formed of silica or quartz, and the human body doesn't really form it. There are rare examples of lacrimal gland ductal stones that have formed. They are formed mostly of calcium carbonate, but they're darker in color and they're more bumpy. So that is not what is happening here.
So if it's impossible for tear ducts to make glass, then could this all have somehow been staged?
There was a gentleman named Joe Nickel. He was able to demonstrate that he could do the same thing by placing a piece of quartz underneath his eye there by lowering the lower eyelid. And then when he manipulated it, he was able to get the piece of quartz to fall out just like that. As you can see, there is ample space between the eyeball and the eyelids for objects to be placed, but please don't try this at home.
Our verdict, this is a staged incident. She's likely using small quartz crystals that have smoother edges than you'd find on shards of broken glass. In the meantime, we'll keep our eyes peeled for evidence of true miracles. Did you know the United Kingdom's Royal Air Force was once responsible for recording all UFO sightings across the UK? That effort was shut down back in 2009, but the recent release of the records has confirmed London is a bona fide hotspot with the most UFO reports of anywhere in the UK. Don't believe it? Look for yourself.
June 2011. It's a partly cloudy day in London, England, when suddenly a commotion in the streets has one pedestrian pulling out a camera to film this. Did you see that? Let's take another look. 5 glowing orbs pass from one cloud to another. Then, a larger oval-shaped UFO hovers above the city and suddenly darts away. It's a sight that seems to shock the London pedestrians, as well as author and blogger Amy Title.
What's interesting about this video is that it seems to be morphing. It kind of narrows and then expands again to a ring shape. So what could this possibly be?
The UK has reported over 5,000 UFO sightings in the past 20 years. In fact, 7% of Britons say they've seen a UFO, and some of them are aviation professionals.
This sighting is somewhat reminiscent of the story told by Captain James Howard. In 1954, he and a crew were flying a Stratocruiser to London, and they saw an oblong or an elongated black object with kind of upturned ends that were curved. And as they watched it, it morphed, it changed shape, and became a flat object with a pointed wing, almost looking like a shark's fin. This video bears some similarities to this commercial pilot's sighting. And in both of these sightings, the main body seems to morph. In this video, it's a circle that squishes into an oval and then goes back into a circle again.
Even before the media sensation of Captain Howard's sighting, the British government was well aware of UFOs in their airspace. In fact, in 1952, Winston Churchill himself wrote a letter asking for an official report on flying saucers. It's a short letter. Let me read it to you. What does all this stuff about flying saucers amount to? What can it mean? What is the truth? Let me have a report at your convenience. WSC. So are they back? We take that question to our team of experts.
First, we talk to aviation expert Tim McMillan to find out if there's any known aircraft that matches this object.
It's definitely odd. If it was, say, your normal conventional aircraft, we would see wings. We would see a tail stabilizer. And it needs to have forward momentum. And in this case, we see it hovering.
So if it's not a plane, what about a craft that can hover?
Is it a helicopter? A, it doesn't look like a helicopter. And B, it does a couple of maneuvers that are really inconsistent with a helicopter. It rather suddenly darts one direction, appears to dip in altitude, and then go back up in altitude to form a stable hover. Not really what you would see with even military helicopters.
Okay, the shape doesn't match any typical aircraft. What about something that does match the shape, like a balloon?
You can see lenticular-shaped, large, different atmospheric balloons, but yet we're left with the fact that it doesn't maneuver like a balloon.
It's the quick starts and stops that don't fit for McMillan.
If a balloon is caught in the airflow of the upper atmosphere, it's going to go with that, and that's not really what we're seeing here. So we're seeing something that appears to be under controlled flight.
Without any conventional explanation, we turn to forensic video analyst Michael Prima. So could this be a fake?
Typically, multiple witnesses viewing something is sufficient to be able to verify that there's something upward in the sky that they're all looking at.
Primo says a thorough examination of the metadata reveals a crucial clue.
In the macro block analysis, we see all of these different colors, and when something is created in a software program, these macro blocks are random, as you see here, because its goal is to shrink the file size as much as possible, so the actual pixel content that goes into the video when it's created have all been changed drastically.
For Primo, that's all he needs to know.
The gradients that were used to blend the sky with these UFOs was compelling. This is probably the most convincing hoax that I've ever analyzed, mostly because at the preliminary level of the examination, it even had me fooled for a brief moment.
The night the footage first surfaced, it arrived without ceremony, slipped into the digital bloodstream like a rumor that knew it would outlive denial, a shaky clip posted by a user with no history, no thumbnails, no commentary, just a title that felt deliberately unfinished, modern-day dinosaur sighting, as if the upload had hesitated at the last second, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure whether finishing the word would cross a line that could never be uncrossed, and the video itself, only 42 seconds long, showed a rural stretch of land that might have been anywhere in the American Midwest or the outskirts of a forgotten town where time flattened itself into repetition, the camera trembling as if the person holding it already understood that belief was a liability, the air thick with cicadas, the horizon a low smear of black trees. And then, moving just beyond the tree-line, something rose. Not quickly, not with the cinematic violence people expected from monsters, but with a slow, economical motion that suggested mass, intent, and a biological confidence that didn't care whether it was being observed or recorded. And when the thing stepped forward, 2 steps only, partial, as though testing ground it had not used in a long time, the internet did what it always did. It laughed first because laughter is the easiest shield against the collapse of categories, because dinosaurs were supposed to be safely dead, compressed into museums and CGI budgets. Safely framed as then. Not now. Not maybe. Not again. And yet there it was, or something like it, tall but not enormous, its silhouette wrong in ways that felt deeply unsettling. The proportions neither reptilian nor mammalian in the way popular culture had trained the eye, but bird-like and alien, with a neck that curved rather than craned, and a gait that implied balance rather than menace. And by morning, the clip had been reposted, dissected, debunked, color-corrected, stabilized, mirrored, meme-feed, and then, inevitably, forwarded to the producers of The Proof Is Out There, where it landed on the desk of a junior researcher who almost deleted it out of fatigue, because by that point every week brought sightings of everything from Bigfoot to sky serpents to impossible aircraft, and the job was not to believe but to interrogate, to strip claims down to bones and see what remained. And yet something in this footage refused to dissolve under the usual solvents, something. In the way the creature's center of gravity shifted, in how its shadow fell independent of the camera's shake, in how the sound, low, resonant, not a roar but a kind of breath, refused to sync with any known animal library, and when the clip finally reached the main team, it did so already armored with skepticism, already surrounded by experts prepared to kill it gently, and the host's voice, calm and practiced, framed the question the way the show always did, not as a promise, but as a challenge. What if something long thought impossible wasn't impossible at all? And what if the reason we hadn't found it was because we were looking in the wrong way, with the wrong assumptions at the wrong scale of time, because extinction, as paleontologists knew too well, was rarely clean, and survival often hid in margins, in refuges, in ecological loopholes, and as the episode unfolded, it traced not just the footage but the psychological terrain around it, interviewing biologists who explained how large animals could theoretically remain undiscovered under specific conditions, cryptozoologists who leaned forward just a bit too eagerly, and skeptics who dismantled the clip frame by frame, pointing out compression artifacts, potential costume seams, digital anomalies, and yet none of them could fully account for one detail that lingered like a splinter: the way the creature paused, mid-step, head tilting not toward the camera, but away from it, as if responding to a sound outside the frame. A sound the cameraman never heard or never had time to process, and it was there, in that pause, that the narrative cracked open, because if the footage was fake, it was unusually restrained, uninterested in spectacle, and if it was real, it suggested not a monster but an animal, one that behaved as animals do, with caution, economy, and an indifference to myth. And as viewers watched from couches and phones and late-night beds, the show did what it always did best, which was not to provide answers, but to sharpen the question until it cut through comfort, layering in historical parallels of animals once thought extinct and later rediscovered. The coelacanth dragged from the sea like a fossil that refused to stay dead, the ivory-billed woodpecker haunting southern swamps as rumor and hope, the thylacine reduced to a ghost by grainy footage and longing, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the idea took hold that extinction might not be an event but a process, leaky and reversible in small, unsettling ways, and that if something like a dinosaur, no, not a Tyrannosaurus, not a theme park fantasy, but a lineage-adjacent survivor, a feathered theropod cousin shaped by millions of years of quiet adaptation, had endured, it would not announce itself with thunder, it would appear exactly like this, half-seen, inconvenient, impossible to monetize cleanly and resistant to closure, and outside the show. The world reacted in its usual fractured chorus, believers mapping remote ecosystems where such a creature might hide, skeptics pointing out that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and somewhere in between, a growing number of people who didn't say it's real or it's fake, but I don't know, which was perhaps the most dangerous position of all, because uncertainty breeds curiosity, and curiosity leads people into places they might otherwise ignore, and the cameraman, anonymous, silent, never coming forward, became a kind of negative space in the story. A reminder that behind every piece of evidence was a human choice, a moment of fear or awe or survival instinct. And as the episode closed, the host did not declare victory or defeat, but left viewers with a quiet implication that the modern world, for all its satellites and sensors and certainty, still had blind spots large enough to hide entire narratives. And that maybe the question was not whether dinosaurs could exist today, but whether we were prepared for the idea that the past was not done with us, that it could reach forward through time, brush against our present, and leave behind nothing more than a blurry video and a feeling that something ancient had briefly remembered us and then stepped back into the trees. In the weeks following the episode's broadcast, the footage did not fade the way most mysteries did, but instead hardened, settling into the collective imagination like a question mark carved into stone. And what the proof is out there inadvertently revealed was not merely a possible animal, but a fault line running beneath modern certainty. Because once the idea had been aired that something ancient might still walk the margins of the present, people began to look differently at the world they thought they understood, scanning trillions longer than necessary, replaying old memories of unexplained sounds or fleeting shapes, and the production team, accustomed to watching claims collapse under scrutiny, found themselves in unfamiliar territory as new information trickled in, not from enthusiasts seeking attention but from professionals whose reputations depended on restraint, including a wildlife biologist from Montana who submitted a quiet addendum noting that the gate visible in the footage bore similarities to certain ground birds scaled far beyond known parameters, and a geologist who pointed out that the region where the video was filmed sat atop a mosaic of limestone caverns and sinkholes capable of sheltering large fauna without surface evidence. And although none of this constituted proof, it complicated the dismissal, forcing the show's narrative to widen rather than conclude. And behind the scenes, researchers began cross-referencing databases of unexplained livestock disturbances, missing trail camera footage corrupted in ways inconsistent with known interference, and sound recordings captured by automated forest monitors that registered low-frequency pulses not matching any cataloged species. And as these threads accumulated, the question shifted subtly from, is the video fake, to, if it isn't, what kind of animal could behave this way? And that distinction mattered, because it reframed the phenomenon from spectacle to biology, from myth to ecology, and the second episode in the arc leaned into this shift, opening not with the footage itself, but with a slow pan across a fossil collection, bones laid out under museum lighting, the narrator reminding viewers that birds were not descended from dinosaurs in the abstract sense, but were dinosaurs in the strictest evolutionary terms, living proof that extinction was selective rather than absolute. And as experts spoke, they emphasized that the popular image of dinosaurs as massive, roaring reptiles was a cultural artifact shaped by cinema rather than science, and that a modern survivor would likely be smaller, feathered, cautious, nocturnal, and adapted to avoid humans rather than confront them, which aligned uncomfortably well with what little the footage showed. And still, skepticism held its ground, because plausibility was not evidence, and the show invited critics to dismantle the theory piece by piece, highlighting the absence of physical traces such as tracks, scat, or DNA. And yet, even here, the conversation refused to close cleanly, because the environments under discussion, dense forests, swamp margins, karst landscapes, were precisely the kinds of places where evidence degraded quickly, where humidity erased tracks overnight and scavengers recycled remains within hours. And the host's measured tone underscored a growing tension, that modern science, for all its sophistication, relied heavily on accessibility, and that what lay beyond roads, beyond consistent human presence, beyond a reach of drones and satellites, remained surprisingly underobserved. And as the episode unfolded, it revisited historical cases where disbelief delayed discovery, from the giant squid dismissed as sailors' tales to the okapi hidden in plain sight, and each example chipped away at the assumption that we had already cataloged the world into completeness. And the most unsettling segment arrived not with expert testimony, but with a reconstruction, a Speculative animation built not to dramatize but to hypothesize, showing how a small population of large, avian theropods could theoretically persist in isolated refuges over millions of years, shrinking in size, adapting their metabolism, avoiding open terrain, and breeding slowly enough to remain invisible to casual observation, and the animation ended not with revelation but with disappearance, the creature melting back into foliage, emphasizing that survival, not dominance, would be the defining trait of such an animal. And outside the studio, viewers responded with an intensity that surprised even the producers, with some accusing the show of sensationalism and others thanking it for restraint. And in online forums, amateur naturalists began organizing expeditions not to hunt but to listen, deploying audio recorders and camera traps, and though most returned empty-handed, a few reported anomalies they could not easily classify, including rhythmic ground vibrations felt but not heard, and moments of sudden, collective silence in forests where insects and birds abruptly cease their calls, a phenomenon known but poorly understood, often attributed to predator presence. And while none of this confirmed the existence of a modern dinosaur, it reinforced the idea that something disrupted expected patterns, and the show's third segment focused on the anonymous filmer, not to unmask them but to analyze the context, examining the metadata that remained intact, confirming that the timestamp aligned with regional weather records, that the lighting conditions matched the reported hour, and that the absence of narration or reaction suggested either shock or a deliberate choice to remain unobtrusive. And psychologists weighed in, noting that hoaxers typically framed their evidence, guiding the viewer's attention, whereas this clip seemed almost indifferent to being watched. And yet doubt persisted, because doubt was the backbone of inquiry, and the episode closed with a return to first principles, asking not whether viewers believed, but whether they could accept uncertainty without immediately resolving it into comfort. And the final image lingered on a forest at dusk, empty, still, the narrator reminding the audience that the most profound discoveries often announce themselves quietly, leaving behind only questions, and that whether or not the creature in the footage represented a surviving dinosaur, it had already succeeded in doing something rare. It had made people look at the natural world not as a closed book but as a draft still being written, with margins wide enough to accommodate the unexpected. And in that sense, the mystery was not an intrusion from the past but a mirror held up to the present, reflecting how little certainty it actually took to unsettle a species that believed it had seen everything. As the investigation widened beyond the studio and into the field, what became increasingly clear was that the mystery was no longer centered on a single piece of footage, but on a pattern of absences, and absence, as every seasoned investigator knows, can be as telling as presence, because when the research team began mapping reported anomalies across several states, unexplained livestock agitation, trail cameras inexplicably disabled without signs of tampering, hikers describing fleeting impressions of mass and movement just beyond peripheral vision, they noticed that these events did not cluster randomly, but seemed to trace ecological corridors long abandoned by human traffic, ancient migration routes carved not by highways, but by rivers, ridgelines, and fault lines. And this realization reframed the narrative yet again, shifting it from the sensational to the systemic, suggesting that if an unknown large animal existed, it was not wandering aimlessly, but following patterns encoded deep in the land itself. Patterns older than roads, older than property lines, perhaps older than recorded history, and the proof is out there devoted the next phase of its inquiry to these corridors, bringing in landscape ecologists who explained how animals, especially those under pressure, often relied on ghost pathways, routes that remained biologically relevant long after humans forgot them. And the implication was unsettling in its simplicity. Something could move through the modern world without being seen, not because it was supernatural, but because it was methodical, and the show's tone reflected this shift, becoming quieter, more deliberate, as though the investigation itself was learning to move with the same caution as its subject. And one segment focused on sound, an aspect often overlooked because it resisted easy visualization. And audio engineers analyzed recordings submitted by viewers who had set up passive listening devices in remote areas, filtering out known frequencies until only the unexplained remained, and what emerged were low, pulsing vibrations that did not fit neatly into any biological catalog. too rhythmic to be geological, too sustained to be mechanical, and yet inconsistent enough to defy pattern recognition. And skeptics rightly pointed out that such sounds could result from a variety of natural sources. But even they conceded that the frequencies overlapped intriguingly with those theorized for large, air sac-assisted respiratory systems, the kind associated not with mammals but with avian dinosaurs, and the show was careful here, emphasizing that overlap was not confirmation, that coincidence was not causation, but the cumulative weight of these details began to press on the edges of dismissal, and the investigation took a more philosophical turn, examining why the idea of a surviving dinosaur provoked such visceral reactions, and cultural historians traced this discomfort to humanity's need for temporal order, the comfort derived from believing that the past stayed past, that extinction marked clean endings, and that the world moved forward in a straight line, and a living dinosaur, even a modest one, disrupted that narrative, suggesting that time could fold back on itself, that ancient threads could persist quietly alongside the present, and that our dominion over the planet might be less absolute than assumed. And this discomfort manifested not only in skepticism but in hostility, with the show receiving criticism for entertaining fantasy, even as it consistently avoided definitive claims, and this tension underscored a deeper truth the series gradually exposed, that uncertainty itself had become threatening in an era addicted to instant resolution, and as the episode unfolded, the team revisited the original filming location, not with cameras blazing but with minimal equipment, guided by local residents who spoke reluctantly, if at all, about strange occurrences, and these interviews were notable not for what was said but for what was withheld, the pauses, the careful phrasing, the glances toward the treeline as if something there did not appreciate attention, and one elderly landowner described how, decades earlier, his father had warned him never to follow certain sounds at dusk, calling them the old walkers, a phrase dismissed at the time as folklore but now resonant with new context. And the show resisted the temptation to mythologize this account, instead, situating it among countless examples of local knowledge dismissed by formal science. And when the crew deployed modern tools, thermal imaging, motion sensors, aerial surveys, they found little of substance, but what they did find was consistency in emptiness, an absence of expected wildlife in certain zones that should have been thriving. And ecologists noted that such voids often indicated the presence of an apex or near-apex organism exerting pressure on the ecosystem, and yet no known predator fit the profile, and this raised the possibility that the creature, if real, occupied a niche that science had not formally acknowledged, not because it was impossible but because it was inconvenient, existing at the margins of classification. And as the episode drew toward its conclusion, the host returned to the idea that proof was not a single moment but a convergence, a slow alignment of evidence, context, and willingness to see, and the final act did not offer revelation but reflection, juxtaposing the original footage with everything that had followed, not to amplify its mystery but to demonstrate how a simple clip had expanded into a broader inquiry about knowledge itself, and the narrator posed a question that lingered long after the screen went dark. If something like this could exist unnoticed for so long, what else might be sharing our world without our permission or awareness? And in that silence, viewers were left not with fear, but with a quiet recalibration of scale, a sense that humanity's map of reality might be more provisional than permanent, and that the most unsettling possibility was not that dinosaurs still lived among us, but that the world remained far less finished than we liked to believe. By the time the investigation reached its fourth phase, the question was no longer whether the original footage could be proven real or fake in isolation, but whether modern frameworks of verification were even equipped to confront phenomena that existed deliberately at the edge of observation. And the Proof Is Out There began to interrogate its own methodology, openly acknowledging that the scientific tools designed to catalog wildlife assumed a baseline of detectability that might not apply to an organism shaped by millions of years of avoiding notice. And this self-reflection marked a tonal shift in the series, moving away from adversarial debunking toward a quieter examination of epistemology itself, because if a creature had survived not by dominance, but by concealment, then its greatest adaptation would not be physical but behavioral, and this idea guided the next segment. which explored how intelligence and environmental sensitivity could function as survival traits. Independent of brain size, drawing parallels with animals known to alter their routines in response to human presence, such as wolves shifting to nocturnal movement or octopuses exploiting visual ambiguity, and experts suggested that a relict dinosaur species, if it existed, would likely possess an acute sensitivity to vibration, sound, and pattern disruption, enabling it to detect humans long before being detected itself, and this hypothesis offered a chilling reinterpretation of the footage's most debated moment, the creature's pause and head tilt, which now appeared less like curiosity and more like assessment, as if the animal had already detected the observer and was deciding whether continued exposure posed a risk, and the show underscored that such decision-making did not require human-like cognition, only an evolved response to threat. And this reframing cast the anonymous filmer not as a witness to something stumbling into view, but as a brief variable in a long-established equation of avoidance, and the episode then expanded outward, examining how large-scale environmental changes might inadvertently erode such concealment, pushing hidden species into momentary visibility, and climate scientists discussed how shifting temperature bands, altered prey distributions, and increased human encroachment could disrupt ancient equilibrium, forcing even the most elusive organisms to adjust their ranges, sometimes crossing into human perception for the first time in centuries. And this contextualization lent the footage a sense of inevitability rather than anomaly, suggesting that sightings might increase not because creatures were emerging, but because the boundaries that once hid them were thinning, and the show carefully avoided alarmism, emphasizing that ecological stress often produced fleeting overlaps rather than sustained encounters, and that the absence of subsequent footage did not weaken the case so much as align with it, reinforcing the notion that whatever had been seen was not interested in repetition, and as the episode progressed, it returned to the theme of classification, questioning whether the word dinosaur itself obscured more than it revealed, because the term carried cinematic baggage that skewed expectations toward size and aggression, whereas the evidence, sparse as it was, suggested restraint, efficiency, and integration rather than domination. And paleontologists interviewed noted that many non-avian dinosaurs occupied ecological roles analogous to modern mid-level predators or omnivores, operating within complex systems rather than atop them, and this insight reframed the potential impact of such a survivor, portraying it not as an existential threat, but as a missing thread in an already intricate web, and yet the psychological impact remained profound, because acknowledging its existence required acknowledging a gap in human oversight, and sociologists explored why such gaps provoked resistance, arguing that modern identity was deeply tied to the belief that humanity had mapped, named, and mastered the planet, and that unclassified life challenged that narrative not violently but persistently, like an unresolved footnote, and this resistance manifested in dismissive humor, aggressive debunking, and selective skepticism, all mechanisms for restoring cognitive order. And the show did not condemn these reactions, instead situating them as natural responses to uncertainty, and in a particularly introspective moment, the host addressed the audience directly, admitting that the desire for a definitive answer was understandable but potentially misplaced, because some questions function not to be closed but to recalibrate perception, and the episode then revisited earlier cases of cryptic species whose existence was confirmed only after decades of doubt, not because evidence suddenly appeared, but because attention shifted, methodologies improved, and observers learned to interpret signs previously ignored, and this historical perspective softened the mystery, embedding it within a continuum rather than isolating it as an aberration, and as the narrative approached its conclusion, it returned once more to the landscape itself, filming long, unbroken shots of forests, wetlands, and transitional zones where ecosystems blurred into one another, emphasizing liminality as a recurring theme, not only in geography but in knowledge, and the narrator suggested that the creature, whether real or imagined, occupied a similar threshold between eras, between categories, between belief and dismissal, and the final moments of the episode offered no reveal, no escalation, but a deliberate quiet, the camera lingering on an empty clearing at dusk while ambient sounds gradually faded, leaving only wind through leaves, And in that stillness, viewers were invited to consider that the most unsettling aspect of the mystery was not the possibility of a surviving dinosaur, but the realization that certainty itself might be a luxury rather than a foundation, and that living with unanswered questions might be less a failure of knowledge than an acknowledgement of the world's depth, a depth that occasionally allowed something ancient to brush against the present and remind us, briefly and without explanation, that not everything that matters announces itself clearly. What gradually emerged during the 5th chapter of the investigation was an uncomfortable realization that the search for proof had begun to alter the behavior of those conducting it, not in dramatic or unethical ways, but subtly, through heightened attentiveness and recalibrated expectations, because once the possibility of a hidden survivor entered the frame, even seasoned researchers found themselves interpreting familiar data through a different lens, and the proof is out there chose to confront this cognitive shift directly, dedicating significant time to examining how belief, skepticism, and pattern recognition interact under prolonged uncertainty. And psychologists explained that the human brain, when presented with ambiguous stimuli, oscillates between dismissal and fixation, often constructing narratives not to deceive, but to stabilize perception, and this insight proved crucial because it allowed the series to acknowledge a central tension without collapsing into self-doubt, that searching for something unknown inevitably changes the observer, and that this change must be accounted for if the inquiry is to retain integrity. And with this framework established, the episode returned to the field, focusing not on dramatic expeditions, but on long-term monitoring efforts that favored patience over intrusion, including extended deployments of passive sensors designed to record environmental baselines rather than anomalies, with the intention of identifying subtle deviations over time. And what these sensors revealed was not evidence of a creature per se, but a recurring disruption of equilibrium, moments when entire microecosystems appeared to adjust simultaneously, insects falling silent, small mammals retreating, birds altering flight paths, all within narrow temporal windows that resisted attribution to weather or known predators. And ecologists emphasized that such synchronized responses suggested a stimulus perceived as both unfamiliar and significant. And while skeptics cautioned against overinterpretation, even they conceded that the consistency warranted further study, and the show framed this not as confirmation but as context, reinforcing the idea that if a large, reclusive organism existed, its presence would be felt more than seen, expressed through pressure rather than spectacle. And the episode then shifted toward history, exploring how indigenous and pre-industrial communities interpreted similar disruptions, not as isolated events, but as signals embedded within a broader understanding of land and time. And anthropologists highlighted oral traditions describing old beings or ground walkers that avoided humans and appeared only during periods of ecological transition. And while the show carefully avoided conflating mythology with evidence, it acknowledged that such narratives often encoded observations accumulated across generations, offering a form of longitudinal data long dismissed by formal science. And this acknowledgement marked another subtle evolution in tone, as the series began to treat alternative knowledge systems not as competitors to scientific inquiry, but as potential complements, especially when dealing with phenomena that defied brief observation. And the episode underscored that this integration did not require belief, only respect for the possibility that different epistemologies might illuminate different aspects of the same reality. And as the investigation deepened, it revisited the anonymous footage once more, this time focusing on what it did not show, noting the absence of panic, commentary, or pursuit. And behavioral analysts suggested that the filmer's stillness indicated an instinctive recognition of risk, not necessarily fear, but an understanding that remaining unnoticed was mutually beneficial. And this interpretation cast the encounter as a brief overlap between two cautious intelligences rather than a confrontation, and the show juxtaposed this analysis with interviews from individuals who reported similar moments of restrained observation, describing sensations of being assessed rather than threatened. And while anecdotal, these accounts shared a tone of quiet unease rather than terror, reinforcing the hypothesis that the creature's primary survival strategy was avoidance. And the narrative then turned inward again, questioning the implications of discovery. And conservationists raised a paradox rarely discussed in popular media, that Proving the existence of a hidden species could endanger it, exposing habitats to exploitation, curiosity-driven intrusion, and institutional disruption, and this ethical dimension reframed the pursuit of proof as a responsibility rather than a triumph, suggesting that restraint might be as important as revelation. And the show did not shy away from this tension, openly questioning whether some knowledge might be better approached asymptotically rather than seized outright. And this theme resonated with viewers, sparking debates not about whether the creature existed, but about what humanity owed to the unknown. And as the episode approached its conclusion, it returned to the broader question of modern extinction narratives, challenging the assumption that survival must be visible to be valid. And biologists noted that many species persist in low numbers precisely because visibility correlates with vulnerability, and that the absence of data often reflected methodological blind spots rather than absence of life. And this insight extended beyond the mystery at hand, prompting a reevaluation of how modern science defines success and failure, presence and absence. And the final segment brought the focus back to the land itself, emphasizing that landscapes were not static backdrops but active participants in survival, shaping movement, perception, and opportunity. And long, quiet shots lingered on transitional zones where ecosystems overlapped, reinforcing the idea that liminality was not an exception but a rule. And the narrator concluded with a reflection that felt less like a thesis and more like an invitation, suggesting that whether or not a modern dinosaur ever stepped fully into proof, the investigation had already revealed something enduring, that the world remained capable of surprise, not because it was unknowable, but because knowledge itself was a process rather than a destination. And in that understanding, uncertainty transformed from a threat into a space of humility, where curiosity could coexist with caution, and where the possibility of an ancient survivor served less as an answer than as a reminder that the present was layered atop deep time, and that occasionally, through gaps we barely noticed, those layers still touched. By the sixth stage of the inquiry, the investigation had quietly crossed a threshold, moving from the pursuit of external validation into a deeper confrontation with the limits of observation itself. And the proof is out there acknowledged this transition not through spectacle, but through tone, slowing its pacing and allowing ambiguity to occupy more space. Because it had become increasingly evident that whatever lay behind the original footage, if anything did, was not inclined to resolve itself on human timelines, and this realization prompted the team to re-examine one of the most persistent assumptions underpinning modern investigation: that truth, once approached with sufficient rigor, would eventually reveal itself in a definitive form. And philosophers of science interviewed during this phase challenged that assumption, noting that many truths remained probabilistic, contextual, or contingent, particularly in complex systems where variables interacted nonlinearly. And the possible existence of a relict dinosaur lineage embedded within such a system exemplified this challenge, because its detectability would fluctuate with environmental conditions, human activity, and its own adaptive strategies, making any single observation insufficient as proof. And this framing reframed the mystery from a hunt to an attunement, emphasizing the need to listen rather than chase. And this shift influenced the methodology of subsequent fieldwork, which prioritized longitudinal data collection over targeted searches, deploying networks of low-impact sensors designed to blend into their surroundings and record continuously for months. And while these devices captured no clear images, they did record patterns of environmental disturbance that defied easy explanation, including subtle but repeated shifts in soil compaction along narrow corridors, vegetation bent without signs of browsing, and transient heat signatures that appeared briefly and then dissipated. And analysts were careful to stress that none of these indicators constituted direct evidence of an unknown animal, but taken together, they suggested movement through the landscape that did not align with known species behavior. And the episode devoted significant time to unpacking this nuance, emphasizing that science often advanced not through dramatic discoveries, but through the gradual recognition that existing models failed to account for observed data. And this intellectual humility became a central theme, reinforced by interviews with veteran researchers who admitted that the most difficult part of their work was not collecting data, but resisting the impulse to force conclusions prematurely. And as the narrative unfolded, It revisited the idea of ecological invisibility, exploring how size did not necessarily correlate with detectability. And biologists cited examples of large animals remaining hidden in dense or rugged environments through a combination of low population density, nocturnal habits, and avoidance of open terrain. And this discussion dovetailed with a reassessment of human sensory limitations, highlighting how modern life dulled our capacity to notice subtle environmental cues, making us paradoxically less perceptive in natural settings despite technological augmentation. And the show suggested that the creature, if real, exploited this gap, moving through spaces humans no longer read fluently, and this notion resonated with accounts from trackers and wilderness guides who described a feeling of being outpaced by the land itself, an awareness that something could traverse terrain more efficiently than any human observer. And although such testimonies remained subjective, they contributed to a growing impression that the mystery was less about concealment and more about misalignment between human perception and ecological reality. And the episode then turned to a question rarely asked explicitly: what would confirmation actually change? And ethicists and conservationists weighed in, arguing that the discovery of a surviving dinosaur-like species would not simply rewrite textbooks but trigger legal, economic, and cultural consequences that could destabilize fragile ecosystems. And this consideration reframed skepticism not as obstruction but as caution, suggesting that restraint served not only scientific rigor but ethical responsibility. And the show treated this argument with respect, acknowledging that the desire to know must be balanced against the potential cost of knowledge. And as the episode progressed, it revisited the original filming location once more, not to search for the creature, but to observe the environment's rhythms over time, capturing dawns and dusks, seasonal shifts, and subtle changes in light and sound. And these sequences served a dual purpose, grounding the investigation in tangible reality while reinforcing the theme of patience. And the narrator reflected on how modern media's appetite for immediacy often clashed with the slow tempos of natural processes, creating a disconnect that fueled both sensationalism and dismissal. And by contrast, the show's willingness to linger without resolution became a statement in itself, an acknowledgement that some inquiries matured only through duration. And the episode's closing segment addressed viewers directly, inviting them not to believe or disbelieve, but to observe their own reactions to uncertainty, noting how discomfort often prompted the urge to categorize, label, and conclude, and how resisting that urge could open space for deeper understanding. And the final image returned to the forest corridor identified earlier in the investigation, empty and unremarkable at first glance, until the camera, held long enough for subtle movement to register, leaves settling, shadows shifting, the environment breathing. And the narrator concluded with a measured reflection that encapsulated the series' evolving perspective, that the pursuit of proof was not always about illumination, but about learning to sit with partial knowledge, to recognize the provisional nature of understanding, and to accept that the world might still contain stories unfolding beyond the reach of immediate confirmation. And in that acceptance, the possibility of a modern dinosaur became less a challenge to reason than an invitation to humility, reminding us that certainty was not the default state of knowledge, but a temporary arrangement negotiated between curiosity, evidence, and time. The seventh movement of the investigation unfolded less like an inquiry and more like a reckoning, as the proof is out there began to confront an unexpected consequence of its own persistence, the realization that the mystery had ceased to belong solely to the show and had instead diffused into a wider cultural current, shaping conversations, behaviors, and expectations in ways both subtle and profound. And this diffusion became the episode's unspoken subject, because while no new definitive evidence had emerged, the idea of a surviving dinosaur lineage had taken on a life independent of verification, influencing how people interpreted their environments and their relationship to uncertainty. And sociologists interviewed during this phase noted that modern societies, accustomed to rapid resolution and authoritative explanation, often struggled with open-ended questions, yet paradoxically gravitated toward them when those questions touched something elemental, such as deep time, extinction, and humanity's place within the natural order. And the show framed this not as a failure of reason, but as a reflection of an unmet psychological need, the need to feel that the world still contained depth beyond commodification. And within this context, the original footage functioned less as evidence and more as a catalyst, a visual prompt that destabilized the assumption that everything meaningful had already been discovered, and the episode traced how this destabilization manifested in unexpected ways, including a rise in amateur naturalist activity, renewed interest in paleontology among younger audiences, and even shifts in conservation discourse that emphasized humility over control. And while critics accused the show of fueling speculative thinking, the producers countered implicitly by highlighting that curiosity, when tempered by responsibility, had historically driven scientific progress, and the episode made clear that the danger lay not in wondering, but in refusing to question the frameworks through which wonder was filtered. And this meta-narrative set the stage for a deeper exploration of absence, focusing on what the investigation had not found despite sustained effort. And ecologists explained that prolonged absence of confirmation did not necessarily weaken the hypothesis, but instead narrowed its scope, forcing more precise articulation of conditions under which such a creature could exist. And this refinement process, often invisible to audiences, was foregrounded deliberately, as the show documented debates among experts who disagreed not on whether the footage was compelling, but on what questions it legitimately raised. And this internal friction was presented not as dysfunction but as the engine of rigorous inquiry, and the episode then turned to an examination of false positives, acknowledging that many reported anomalies could be attributed to known phenomena misinterpreted under heightened expectation, and rather than undermining the investigation, this candid acknowledgement strengthened its credibility, demonstrating a commitment to discernment over affirmation. And yet, even after filtering out misidentifications, a residue remained, a set of observations that resisted clean explanation without invoking either extreme skepticism or uncritical belief. And it was within this residue that the show located its most compelling material, not as proof but as provocation, and the narrative then shifted to a philosophical register, drawing on thinkers who argued that modern epistemology often privileged visibility and measurability at the expense of relational understanding, and applied this critique to the mystery at hand, suggesting that the search for a living dinosaur might be less about isolating an organism and more about recognizing patterns of interaction within ecosystems that had been oversimplified. And this perspective reframed the creature, if it existed, not as an anomaly, but as an emergent property of a system that humans only partially understood. And the episode illustrated this idea through extended sequences of environmental observation, allowing viewers to experience time passing without commentary, inviting them to notice subtle changes that defied immediate categorization. And these sequences functioned as both evidence and pedagogy, training attention rather than directing belief. And the narrator emphasized that such attentiveness was increasingly rare in a world mediated by alerts and summaries, and that the investigation itself required a reorientation of perception. And as the episode progressed, it revisited the ethical dimension raised earlier, delving deeper into the implications of discovery, and conservationists reiterated that confirmation could trigger protective measures, but also exploitation, tourism, and politicization, all of which carried risks. And this dilemma underscored a paradox at the heart of the inquiry, that proof, often regarded as an unqualified good, could produce harm if divorced from stewardship, and the show did not resolve this paradox, instead presenting it as an integral part of the mystery, inseparable from the biological question. And in a particularly reflective segment, the host addressed the audience's expectations, acknowledging the desire for closure while gently challenging it, suggesting that some investigations matured not toward answers, but toward better questions, and that this maturation was itself a form of progress. And the episode's structure mirrored this ethos, resisting dramatic escalation and instead building toward a quiet synthesis of themes. And as it neared its conclusion, it returned once more to the original footage, now contextualized by months of analysis, debate, and reflection. And what emerged was not a clearer image, but a deeper understanding of why the image mattered, because it represented a moment when the boundary between known and unknown briefly thinned, revealing not a monster or a miracle, but a reminder of continuity across time. and the narrator suggested that the persistence of such questions was not a flaw in knowledge, but a testament to its openness, and the final moments lingered on this idea, juxtaposing images of fossils, living birds, and empty landscapes, weaving them into a visual argument that extinction, survival, and transformation were not discrete states, but points along a spectrum. And the episode closed without conclusion, deliberately, leaving viewers with a sense of unresolved resonance rather than frustration, and in doing so, The Proof Is Out There articulated perhaps its most radical proposition yet, that the value of the search lay not in what it might definitively reveal, but in how it reshaped our relationship to the unknown, encouraging humility, patience, and a willingness to accept that the world, even now, might still be unfolding stories beyond the reach of immediate proof. By the 8th chapter, the investigation had reached a stage where the absence of revelation itself demanded interpretation, and The Proof Is Out There began to explore the idea that concealment might not be a passive condition but an active state, one shaped by evolutionary pressure and environmental intelligence, and this reframing marked a subtle, yet decisive evolution in the narrative, because it shifted the focus away from what humans failed to see and toward what might have been deliberately unseen, and biologists interviewed during this phase proposed that certain lineages, particularly those surviving mass extinction events, did so not by strength or adaptability alone, but by cultivating behavioral strategies that minimized interaction with dominant species, and if such strategies had been refined over tens of millions of years. The resulting organism would not merely hide but would anticipate intrusion, altering its movement, timing, and exposure in ways that systematically undermine detection, and this hypothesis cast the modern world not as a transparent landscape saturated with surveillance, but as a patchwork of blind zones shaped by habit, expectation, and technological bias, and the show illustrated this concept by examining how monitoring systems were designed around known variables, often ignoring outliers that fell outside expected parameters, effectively rendering certain phenomena invisible not because they were rare, but because they were inconvenient to measure. And this critique extended beyond the mystery at hand, touching on broader questions about how knowledge systems defined relevance and risk, and the episode wove these ideas together through a series of quiet field observations, emphasizing patience over pursuit, and as cameras lingered on unremarkable terrain. The narration suggested that invisibility was not an absence of presence, but a mismatch between observer and observed, and this mismatch, the show argued, had grown more pronounced as humans increasingly mediated their understanding of nature through abstraction rather than immersion, and the investigation returned once again to sound, this time focusing on infrasonic frequencies that traveled through ground and air beyond the range of human hearing, and acoustic ecologists explained that many large animals communicated or sensed through such frequencies, using them to coordinate movement or detect distant disturbances, and experimental recordings captured faint, rhythmic pulses that defied easy classification, and while skeptics maintained that these signals could originate from natural or anthropogenic sources, the show emphasized not the origin but the implication that an organism attuned to such frequencies could navigate the landscape with a perceptual advantage inaccessible to human observers, effectively operating within a sensory dimension we rarely considered, and this idea resonated with earlier accounts of sudden environmental silence, reframing those moments as perceptual shifts rather than anomalies, and the episode then examined how the concept of proof itself had evolved historically, tracing a lineage from direct observation to indirect inference, and philosophers of science noted that many accepted realities, from subatomic particles to distant galaxies, were known primarily through effects rather than direct encounter, and this comparison was not offered to equate speculative biology with established physics, but to highlight that inference, when disciplined and cumulative, constituted a legitimate form of knowledge, and within this framework, the investigation's growing body of contextual evidence, ecological disturbances, behavioral gaps, historical parallels, began to resemble not a failure of proof, but a different category of understanding, one that resisted singular confirmation but accumulated weight through coherence, and the show was careful to stress that coherence did not equal truth, but it did warrant attention, and this nuance became central to the episode's tone, which balanced curiosity with restraint, and as the narrative unfolded, It addressed the role of media itself in shaping perception, acknowledging that visual evidence often overshadowed less tangible indicators, and questioning whether the obsession with imagery limited our capacity to recognize phenomena better understood through patterns and processes, and this self-awareness distinguished the episode, as it openly critiqued the conditions under which the mystery had been framed, and the host reflected on how the original footage, though compelling, might have been the least important element in the broader inquiry, serving primarily as an entry point into deeper questions about knowledge, perception, and humility, and this reflection segued into an exploration of timescales, contrasting the immediacy of human attention with the deep temporal rhythms governing ecosystems, and geologists and evolutionary biologists explained that processes shaping survival often unfolded over spans far exceeding individual lifetimes, making them difficult to apprehend within modern media cycles, and the episode suggested that the creature, if real, existed not in opposition to modernity, but orthogonal to it, moving along temporal currents that intersected human awareness only briefly and incidentally, and this perspective softened the sense of confrontation that had initially characterized the mystery, replacing it with a sense of parallelism, and the show then revisited the ethical implications of continued inquiry, questioning whether persistent observation constituted a form of disturbance, and conservationists argued that even non-invasive monitoring could alter behavior if detected, reinforcing the idea that restraint was not only ethical, but methodologically sound. And this argument culminated in a decision by the production team to limit further field deployment, opting instead to analyze existing data rather than escalate intrusion, and this choice marked a departure from typical investigative escalation, underscoring the series' commitment to responsibility over resolution, and as the episode approached its conclusion, it returned to the cultural impact of the mystery, examining how it had reshaped conversations about extinction, survival, and human exceptionalism, and educators noted increased engagement with evolutionary biology, while artists and writers drew inspiration from the idea of hidden continuity, and these ripple effects suggested that the mystery's value extended beyond factual determination, functioning as a catalyst for reflection and imagination, and the narrator framed this outcome not as consolation but as consequence, arguing that inquiry often transformed culture even when it failed to deliver definitive answers. And the final sequence of the episode embraced this ambiguity fully, juxtaposing images of ancient fossils with modern landscapes and living birds, dissolving boundaries between past and present, and the narrator offered a measured closing thought that whether or not a modern dinosaur ever stepped fully into proof, the investigation had revealed something enduring about the nature of knowledge itself, that understanding was not a conquest, but a relationship negotiated through attention, patience, and respect for complexity, and that the most meaningful discoveries were not always those that answer questions, but those that taught us how to ask them better. And as the screen faded to black, the silence that followed felt less like absence and more like space, an invitation to listen, to observe, and to accept that some truths moved quietly through the world, indifferent to our need for certainty. By the 9th phase of the investigation, the narrative had matured into something more introspective, less concerned with external validation, and more focused on tracing the subtle consequences of sustained uncertainty, and the proof is out there acknowledged that the prolonged absence of definitive evidence had not weakened the inquiry, but had instead clarified its boundaries, revealing where speculation ended and disciplined curiosity began, and this clarity allowed the series to confront a difficult but necessary question: whether the pursuit of confirmation risked overshadowing the more profound insights already gained, and the episode opened with a reflection on methodological fatigue, a phenomenon familiar to long-term researchers, where persistence itself becomes a variable that must be accounted for, because the longer an investigation continues, the greater the risk that interpretation drifts toward expectation, and to counter this, the team invited external reviewers with no emotional investment in the case to reassess the accumulated data, not to judge its conclusion but to evaluate its coherence, and these reviewers noted that while no single data point constituted proof, the internal consistency of the observations, ecological disturbances, behavioral gaps, historical parallels, formed a pattern that resisted dismissal as mere coincidence. And yet they also emphasized that consistency alone did not equate to causation, reinforcing the investigation's central tension, and the episode treated this critique not as a setback, but as a recalibration, highlighting how rigorous inquiry depended on continual self-correction, and this self-awareness became a defining feature of the narrative, distinguishing it from sensationalist approaches. And as the episode progressed, it examined how human perception of rarity influenced belief, noting that events perceived as rare were often dismissed more readily than those perceived as common, regardless of their significance. And cognitive scientists explained that rarity triggered skepticism not because it was illogical, but because it challenged predictive models that underpinned daily functioning, and the idea of a surviving dinosaur lineage represented an extreme case of rarity, colliding with deeply entrenched expectations about extinction and progress. And the show used this insight to contextualize resistance, framing disbelief not as ignorance, but as a protective cognitive response. And this framing fostered a more empathetic discourse, reducing polarization between believers and skeptics, and the episode then returned to the landscapes central to the mystery, this time examining them through the lens of temporal layering, exploring how environments retain traces of past configurations even as they adapted to modern pressures, and geographers described how ancient riverbeds, fault lines, and vegetation corridors continued to shape movement patterns long after surface features changed, creating a palimpsest of ecological memory. And within this framework, the possibility of a relict species moving along inherited pathways felt less implausible, and the show illustrated this concept through maps overlaying modern infrastructure atop prehistoric terrain, revealing alignments that suggested continuity rather than disruption. And this visualization reinforced the idea that modernity did not erase the past but coexisted with it, often unknowingly. And the episode then addressed the emotional dimension of the inquiry, acknowledging that for many viewers, the mystery resonated not because of its scientific implications, but because it evoked a sense of wonder increasingly absent from adult experience. And psychologists noted that wonder, unlike surprise, thrived on ambiguity and resisted closure. And the investigation's refusal to resolve neatly had inadvertently preserved this emotional space, and the show treated this outcome with care, avoiding exploitation. While recognizing its significance, and as the narrative unfolded, it revisited the original footage once again, not to extract new details, but to reflect on how perception of the clip had evolved over time, and editors demonstrated how initial reactions focused on the creature's appearance, while later analyses emphasized its behavior and context, illustrating a shift from surface evaluation to relational understanding. And this shift mirrored the investigation's broader trajectory, moving from object-centered inquiry towards system-centered reflection, and the episode used this parallel to underscore a key insight, that understanding complex phenomena often required abandoning the search for isolated causes in favor of examining interactions. And this insight extended beyond biology, touching on how societies approached uncertainty in general. And the show drew subtle parallels between the mystery and other unresolved questions, from climate tipping points to emerging diseases, emphasizing that modern challenges often unfolded without clear boundaries or endpoints, and that cultivating tolerance for uncertainty was not a weakness, but a necessity. And this perspective lent the episode a quiet urgency, situating the investigation within a larger cultural moment defined by ambiguity. And as the episode approached its conclusion, it addressed the role of closure in narrative, acknowledging that audiences often expected investigations to culminate in resolution, but questioning whether resolution was always the appropriate endpoint. And literary scholars noted that some narratives achieved power precisely through incompleteness, inviting continued engagement rather than passive consumption. And the show embraced this literary framing, positioning the mystery not as a puzzle to be solved, but as an ongoing dialogue between evidence, interpretation, and humility. And the final segment reflected on how the investigation had altered the show itself, influencing its approach to future cases by emphasizing patience, interdisciplinary collaboration, and ethical restraint. And this reflexivity underscored the investigation's impact beyond its immediate subject, and the narrator concluded with a measured synthesis, suggesting that whether or not a modern dinosaur ever emerged into incontrovertible proof, the inquiry had already revealed something enduring, that the boundaries of knowledge were negotiated rather than fixed, shaped by attention, context, and willingness to remain open, and that in a world increasingly defined by certainty claims, the capacity to dwell thoughtfully within uncertainty might be one of the most valuable skills of all. And as the screen faded, the absence of resolution felt intentional rather than lacking, leaving viewers not with answers, but with an expanded sense of what it meant to ask meaningful questions in a complex and evolving world. By the 10th chapter, the investigation had reached a quiet inflection point where the question of existence began to give way to a more nuanced consideration of coexistence. And the proof is out there acknowledged that even if incontrovertible proof never materialized, the inquiry had already forced a re-examination of how humans understood their relationship with the natural world, because the idea of a surviving dinosaur lineage, however tentative, disrupted the long-standing narrative that humanity occupied a position of complete ecological awareness, and this disruption was not merely academic but psychological, reshaping assumptions about control, knowledge, and permanence, and the episode opened by tracing how similar paradigm shifts had unfolded historically, noting that each time humanity confronted evidence that challenged its sense of mastery, whether through the discovery of microscopic life, deep geological time, or cosmic vastness, the initial reaction was resistance, followed by gradual integration, and the show suggested that the current mystery might represent a comparable threshold, one less dramatic in appearance but equally profound in implication, and this framing set the stage for a deeper exploration of what it meant to live alongside the unknown, rather than seeking to eliminate it through classification or conquest. And environmental philosophers interviewed during this phase argued that modern culture often equated understanding with domination, assuming that to know something was to control it, and they proposed an alternative ethic grounded in attentiveness and restraint, where knowledge served coexistence rather than exploitation, and this ethic resonated strongly with the investigation's evolving tone, which increasingly emphasized listening over asserting, and the episode illustrated this shift through extended sequences of observational footage that resisted narration, allowing viewers to experience the environment without interpretive guidance, and these sequences functioned as both method and message, reinforcing the idea that meaning could emerge from sustained attention rather than immediate explanation, and the narrative then returned to the original anomaly, not to dissect it further, but to situate it within a broader ecological context, examining how rare encounters often occurred at points of transition, edges of habitats, moments of environmental stress, or thresholds of seasonal change, and biologists explained that such liminal moments increased the likelihood of overlap between human and non-human worlds, not because creatures sought contact, but because the boundaries that usually separated them temporarily softened, and this insight reframed the sighting not as an intrusion, but as a coincidence of timing, a brief alignment of trajectories that revealed more about systemic fragility than about any single organism, and the episode then turned to the theme of scale, contrasting human lifespans with evolutionary durations, and paleontologists emphasize that lineages persisted not through constancy, but through continual adaptation, often becoming unrecognizable to those expecting static forms, and this observation challenged popular expectations of what a modern dinosaur should look like, suggesting that fixation on recognizable features might blind observers to subtler continuities. And the show used this argument to critique its own audience's assumptions, inviting viewers to consider whether their mental images of dinosaurs constrained their capacity to perceive evolutionary persistence, and this self-critique extended to the media's role in shaping perception, as the episode examined how visual spectacle often overshadowed ecological context, and how the pursuit of striking imagery could distort understanding by privileging the extraordinary over the systemic. And this reflection reinforced the investigation's commitment to restraint, positioning the absence of dramatic visuals not as a failure, but as a fidelity to the subject's complexity, and as the episode progressed, it explored the social consequences of unresolved mysteries, noting that open-ended inquiries often fostered communities organized around shared curiosity rather than consensus, and sociologists observed that such communities, when guided responsibly, could cultivate scientific literacy, patience, and collaborative thinking, and the show highlighted examples of citizen scientists who contributed data without seeking recognition, motivated by stewardship rather than validation, and these examples countered narratives of sensationalism, demonstrating that uncertainty could inspire constructive engagement rather than division, and the episode then addressed concerns that prolonged ambiguity might encourage misinformation. And media analysts argued that transparency about uncertainty, rather than premature closure, was the most effective antidote to speculation, because it modeled critical thinking rather than authority, and the show embraced this principle by openly acknowledging the limits of its findings, framing them as provisional rather than definitive, and this openness reinforced trust even in the absence of resolution, and as the narrative unfolded, it revisited ethical considerations surrounding discovery, emphasizing that confirmation of a rare species could trigger protective legislation but also unintended harm, and conservationists reiterated that secrecy, while controversial, had historically protected vulnerable populations, and this argument further complicated the desire for proof, suggesting that restraint might serve both epistemic and ethical ends, and the episode did not prescribe a solution to this dilemma, instead presenting it as an ongoing negotiation between curiosity and responsibility. And this negotiation became the episode's emotional core, as the host reflected on the investigation's trajectory, acknowledging the initial expectation of answers and the subsequent realization that the true outcome lay elsewhere, and the episode's closing segment synthesized these themes into a broader meditation on modernity's relationship with mystery, arguing that the erosion of unknowns often paralleled a loss of humility, and that restoring space for uncertainty could recalibrate humanity's sense of proportion within the natural world, and the narrator suggested that the possibility of a surviving dinosaur, whether literal or symbolic, functioned as a corrective to anthropocentrism, reminding us that life's story extended far beyond human chapters, and the final images returned to the landscapes that had framed the investigation from the beginning, now presented not as potential hiding places, but as living systems deserving attention regardless of what they concealed. And the episode concluded with a reflection that felt both sobering and hopeful, proposing that the most enduring legacy of the mystery was not a creature glimpsed in shadow, but a renewed commitment to observing the world with patience, humility, and care, and in that commitment, the investigation found its quiet resolution, not in answers, but in a transformed way of seeing, one that accepted uncertainty not as a failure of knowledge, but as an invitation to coexist respectfully with what remained beyond immediate understanding. By the 11th chapter, the investigation no longer revolved around the urgency of proving or disproving a claim, but instead entered a reflective phase where silence itself became a form of data, and the proof is out there approached the silence not as an absence, but as a presence that demanded interpretation, because the lack of definitive confirmation did not erase the anomaly, it reframed it, transforming the inquiry from a question of physical verification into one of epistemological humility. And the episode opened by revisiting the original moment of uncertainty with a deliberate slowness, stripping away earlier speculation and allowing the event to stand unadorned. And this editorial choice signaled a shift in intent, emphasizing that meaning could persist even when conclusions remained suspended. And researchers interviewed at this stage spoke candidly about the discomfort inherent in unresolved investigations, noting that scientific culture often privileged closure over contemplation, and that this preference could obscure valuable insights that emerged only when ambiguity was allowed to endure, and the episode used this observation to critique broader cultural expectations, suggesting that modern audiences were conditioned to demand answers not because they advanced understanding, but because they restored a sense of control, and this desire for control, the show argued, often distorted the relationship between humans and phenomena that operated on scales or principles beyond immediate comprehension, and the narrative then expanded its scope, situating the mystery within a long tradition of sightings and reports that resisted classification, not because they were necessarily false, but because they existed at the margins of dominant explanatory frameworks. And historians of science pointed out that many accepted discoveries initially occupied similar margins, dismissed not due to lack of evidence, but because they challenged prevailing assumptions about what was possible, and this historical parallel did not assert equivalence, but it contextualized skepticism as a dynamic process rather than a fixed position, and the episode emphasized that skepticism, when practiced responsibly, did not aim to eliminate uncertainty, but to discipline curiosity, and this disciplined curiosity became a recurring theme, illustrated through field researchers who described their work as an ongoing dialogue with environments that could not be fully controlled or predicted, and these researchers emphasized patience as a methodological virtue, arguing that repeated exposure over time often revealed patterns invisible in isolated encounters, and this temporal dimension reframed the investigation once again, suggesting that the question was not whether proof existed now, but whether human observational practices were calibrated to detect phenomena that unfolded slowly or intermittently, and the episode then turned to the psychological impact of prolonged uncertainty, drawing on cognitive science to explain why unresolved mysteries often linger more vividly in memory than resolved ones. And psychologists noted that ambiguity activated deeper cognitive engagement, prompting individuals to revisit assumptions and explore alternative interpretations. And the show proposed that this engagement, while sometimes uncomfortable, could foster a more flexible and resilient form of understanding, one less dependent on definitive answers. And this idea resonated with the episode's visual language, which favored wide, lingering shots over rapid cuts, allowing landscapes to assert their complexity without narrative compression, and these visual choices reinforce the argument that attention itself was a form of respect, and that the act of observing without immediate judgment could recalibrate perception. And the narrative then addressed the ethical dimension of continued investigation, questioning whether the pursuit of certainty justified intrusion into fragile ecosystems, and conservation experts reiterated that restraint was often an ethical necessity, not a concession to ignorance, and they warned that the desire to confirm rare phenomena could inadvertently replicate extractive patterns that had historically damaged biodiversity, and this caution introduced a moral tension that the episode refused to resolve, presenting it instead as an ongoing responsibility shared by scientists, media producers, and audiences alike, and the host acknowledged this shared responsibility directly, reflecting on the role of storytelling in shaping expectations, and conceding that narratives could either cultivate patience or inflame demand, and this reflexivity marked a significant evolution in the series' tone, signaling a willingness to interrogate its own influence rather than positioning itself as a neutral observer. And the episode then explored how unresolved mysteries function culturally, noting that they often served as mirrors for collective anxieties and aspirations, and sociologists observed that stories of surviving prehistoric life resonated not because of their factual status, but because they symbolized continuity in a world perceived as increasingly unstable, and this symbolic dimension did not invalidate the investigation, but it complicated it, suggesting that the mystery's power lay as much in what it represented as in what it might reveal, and the episode treated this symbolic layer with caution, distinguishing between metaphorical resonance and empirical claims, and emphasizing that acknowledging symbolic meaning did not require abandoning methodological rigor, and as the narrative progressed, it revisited the concept of evidence itself, questioning whether traditional hierarchies of proof adequately accounted for phenomena that resisted replication. And philosophers of science argued that while extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, they also required extraordinary patience, because rarity by definition limited opportunities for verification, and this argument reframed skepticism as a temporal stance rather than a definitive verdict, and the episode illustrated this reframing through examples of long-term ecological studies that only yielded insights after decades of observation. And these examples reinforced the idea that absence of immediate proof did not equate to proof of absence, but neither did it justify premature affirmation. And this balance became the episode's guiding principle, maintaining tension without tipping into speculation, and the closing segment synthesized these reflections into a meditation on silence as a form of knowledge, suggesting that what remained unsaid or unseen could still shape understanding by delineating the limits of perception. And the narrator proposed that the true lesson of the investigation lay not in resolving the mystery, but in learning how to inhabit it responsibly, and the final images echoed this sentiment, returning once more to the environments that had anchored the inquiry, now framed not as sites of concealment, but as spaces of ongoing interaction between known and unknown, and the episode concluded with a quiet acknowledgement that some questions endured not because they lacked answers, but because they continued to matter, and in that endurance, the investigation found its purpose, not in closure, but in cultivating a sustained attentiveness to a world that remained, in many ways, larger and more complex than human understanding could fully contain. The final chapter of the investigation unfolded not as a revelation, but as a deliberate pause, an intentional deceleration that invited reflection rather than resolution, and The Proof Is Out There embraced this pause as its most honest statement, recognizing that some inquiries reach their truest expression not in answers, but in the clarity gained from sustained questioning. And the episode opened with a return to the beginning, not to reanalyze footage or restate hypotheses, but to acknowledge the curiosity that initiated the search, emphasizing that curiosity itself was neither naive nor misguided, but a fundamental human impulse that propelled exploration long before certainty was possible, and this framing set the tone for a conclusion that honored the process over the outcome, and the narrative revisited the concept of proof, dissecting it not as a static threshold, but as a culturally mediated construct shaped by expectations, technologies, and historical context. And philosophers interviewed in this final segment argued that proof was often less about absolute truth and more about collective agreement, a consensus reached when evidence aligned sufficiently with prevailing models of understanding, and this insight reframed the absence of proof not as failure, but as misalignment between phenomenon and framework, suggesting that the mystery's resistance to confirmation might reveal limitations in human categorization rather than deception or error, and the episode treated this possibility with intellectual restraint, careful not to elevate speculation into assertion, but equally careful not to dismiss it prematurely, and this balance reflected the maturity the investigation had acquired over time, and the narrative then addressed the role of technology, acknowledging both its power and its constraints. And experts noted that while modern tools expanded observational reach, they also filtered perception through predefined parameters, potentially overlooking phenomena that did not conform to expected signatures, and this technological mediation underscored a paradox, that increasing sophistication could simultaneously enhance and narrow awareness, and the episode used this paradox to challenge assumptions about progress, suggesting that advancement did not guarantee comprehensiveness, and that some aspects of reality might remain elusive precisely because they fell outside dominant detection paradigms, and this argument resonated with the investigation's broader theme of humility, reinforcing the idea that knowledge expanded not only through accumulation, but through recognition of what remained unknown, and the episode then explored the emotional arc of the investigation, acknowledging the subtle shift from anticipation to acceptance that both the team and the audience experienced. And psychologists describe this shift as a form of cognitive reconciliation, where the mind integrated uncertainty without resolving it, allowing curiosity to persist without frustration, and this reconciliation marked a quiet achievement, one rarely celebrated in narrative culture, which often privileged decisive endings, and the show highlighted this contrast, suggesting that unresolved inquiries could foster deeper engagement by inviting ongoing interpretation rather than passive consumption, and this idea extended to the audience's role, positioning viewers not as recipients of answers, but as participants in a shared exploration, and the episode acknowledged that this participatory model carried responsibility, encouraging discernment, patience, and respect for complexity, and as the narrative progressed, it examined the cultural symbolism of surviving prehistoric life one final time, not to amplify myth, but to contextualize its enduring appeal. And sociologists observed that such symbols often emerged during periods of rapid change, offering continuity amid perceived instability, and the episode suggested that the mystery's resonance reflected broader anxieties about loss, extinction, and the accelerating pace of transformation, and by situating the inquiry within this cultural landscape, the show avoided reducing it to a binary debate about belief, instead framing it as a mirror reflecting collective concerns, and this framing enriched the investigation without compromising its analytical integrity. And the narrative then addressed ethics, once more, emphasizing that restraint had been a defining choice, and conservationists reiterated that the decision to step back, to resist invasive verification, represented not abandonment but respect, and this respect aligned with a growing recognition that not all phenomena needed to be captured, categorized, or controlled to be acknowledged, and the episode treated this recognition as a form of progress, suggesting that maturity in inquiry involved knowing when to pursue and when to observe, and this ethical stance distinguished the investigation from exploitative approaches, reinforcing its credibility even in the absence of definitive proof. And the final act of the episode focused on legacy, asking what remained after the cameras stopped rolling and the analysis concluded, and the answer was not evidence, but perspective, a recalibrated approach to uncertainty that valued attentiveness over certainty and dialogue over declaration. And the narrator reflected on how the investigation had transformed the series itself, shaping future inquiries with greater patience and interdisciplinary collaboration. And this reflexivity underscored that the impact of the mystery extended beyond its subject, influencing how questions would be asked going forward, and the closing moments returned once more to the landscapes that had anchored the story, now presented without commentary, allowing silence to speak. And this silence was not emptiness, but space, a space where questions could linger without pressure to resolve. And the narrator offered a final synthesis, suggesting that the true proof uncovered by the investigation was not of a surviving dinosaur, but of humanity's capacity to engage responsibly with the unknown, to balance curiosity with humility, and to accept that some truths unfolded slowly or remained just beyond reach. And the episode concluded with the acknowledgement that the mystery persisted not as an unresolved problem, but as an invitation to continue observing, questioning, and respecting the complexity of a world that still held more than it revealed. And in this invitation, the investigation found its quiet resolution, not in closure, but in continuity.